Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we are diving straight into a fascinating and, frankly, highly charged piece of political media. We're breaking down a source titled The Hunters Are Hunted, Trump's Hot Summer Begins, which was published by the channel Promethean Overviews. Now, the material here, it is dense, it's sweeping, and it's intensely partisan. But remember, our goal today isn't to endorse or debunk these claims. Instead, we're just going to map out exactly how this channel constructs its narrative, using their own frameworks to really understand the argument they're presenting to their audience. Let's get right into it.
Okay, let's dive into this. This dramatic quote really sets the stage, doesn't it? It establishes the core premise of the source material. They're framing the current political landscape not as your standard run-of-the-mill election cycle, but as a massive, decade-long role reversal. The channel is essentially arguing that those who allegedly targeted Donald Trump for years, well, now they're the ones in the crosshairs.
Because this source material is so sprawling, we're going to use a quick roadmap to map out their arguments systematically. First, we'll look at the core allegation. Second, unpacking the rolling coup. Third, the historical analogy. Fourth, the counteroffensive. And finally, the promised outcome. So, starting with Section 1, the core allegation, specifically the claims against the Obama apparatus. The source centers its entire narrative around one very specific accusation regarding the 2016 election, and they use this as the absolute foundation for everything else that follows. The channel literally anchors its entire theory on this specific quote from a July 23, 2025 press conference given by Director of National Intelligence Tulsi Gabbard. According to the source, Gabbard claimed there is irrefutable evidence that the Obama administration manufactured false intelligence to subvert the 2016 election. For this channel, this statement is the absolute proof that a coordinated conspiracy originated directly from the very top. Building right on top of that, the source introduces this concept they call the permanent resistance. They name former officials, think James Clapper, John Brennan, Susan Rice, and Lisa Monaco. The allegation here is that when Obama left office in 2017, this group didn't just quietly fade away. No. The channel claims they actually orchestrated a massive divide-and-conquer race-baiting operation. The narrator argues that this group purposely amplified media coverage of police shootings just to escalate racial tensions, while at the same time completely ignoring inner-city black-on-black crime. And the stated goal? To turn Americans against each other. Moving on to Section 2. Unpacking the rolling coup. A decade of alleged coordination. This is where the source takes numerous, entirely distinct national events from the past 10 years and basically bundles them up into one single, continuous conspiracy framework. Now, what's really interesting about laying out these events chronologically is how it visualizes the sheer massive scale of the host's claim. They call it a rolling coup. They're arguing that things like the Russiagate investigation, the COVID lockdowns, the summer protest, the sudden shift to mail-in ballots, and even the Transition Integrity Project's election war games run by Rosa Brooks in 2020, that all of these were highly coordinated operations. And it doesn't stop there. They extend this timeline all the way through to include January 6, the Mar-a-Lago raid, the Jack Smith indictments, and even the attempted assassinations. The thesis here is that absolutely none of these were random, isolated events. Instead, they were deliberate steps in a relentless campaign by the so-called permanent resistance. That brings us to Section 3, the historical analogy, drawing parallels to British rule. Let's take a look at the historical framework the source relies on to actually explain the motives behind this alleged rolling coup and the tactics they claim are being used against the public. The host makes a very explicit comparison here. They compare the alleged manipulation of modern America directly to the British Empire's strategy in 1947 India. The claim is that, just as the British supposedly propped up Hindus and Muslims against each other to create anger and division, the modern Obama apparatus is using racial tensions and lockdown conditions to intentionally create chaos today. They're arguing this is a deliberate, calculated divide-and-conquer method designed to literally tear the nation apart. To really drive this analogy home, the source zeroes in on this staggering number, 2 million. That's the estimated death toll of the civil war that erupted in India when the British pulled out. The narrator presents this huge historical tragedy as a dire warning. They're basically saying, look, this level of destruction is exactly what happens when a nation is targeted and divided by its very own rulers. Then they bring this whole analogy straight into the present day using a really shocking, specific anecdote from modern Britain. They bring up the case of Henry Nowak, an 18-year-old who was allegedly stabbed 5 times. According to the source, when the police showed up, they actually handcuffed the bleeding victim instead of the attacker, simply because the attacker cried racism. The channel uses this story as a dark illustration of the ultimate absurd danger of these psychological warfare tactics. They claim this is exactly the future America is facing if these forces aren't stopped in their tracks. Section 4. The counter-offensive. Trump's key allies strike back. All right, having established this sprawling conspiracy, the channel pivots to outline their proposed solution. They detail what they're calling a counter-coup, which is supposedly being led by a very specific set of newly appointed figures.
And this brilliantly illustrates how the channel maps out this whole counteroffensive. They attribute some very specific, really aggressive actions to these three figures. For instance, they claim former DNI Tulsi Gabbard personally walked in and secured 2020 ballots in Fulton County on January 28th and exposed the Intel Community Inspector General Michael Atkinson. Then, they assert that current DNI Bill Pai actually used mortgage fraud investigations to target political opponents, specifically naming federal Governor Lisa Cook, Senator Adam Schiff, and New York AG Letitia James. Finally, they claim Acting Attorney General Todd Blanche has completely ended Department of Justice slow walking by ripping out the bureaucrats who were sitting on charges against Brennan. The source frames these three not just as standard political appointees, but as a coordinated, uncompromising strike team executing a master plan for total victory.
A huge part of this alleged counteroffensive is legal action. The source claims there are over 150 subpoenas out right now, including one for James Comey on conspiracy charges. But here's the crucial detail. The narrator heavily emphasizes that this grand jury is based in Fort Pierce, Florida, run by prosecutor Jody Geneva under Judge Eileen Cannon. The argument here is that moving this legal fight down to Florida is a very deliberate tactical move to avoid what they describe as a completely rigged and controlled venue up in Washington, D.C. They also argue that the traditional political establishment is basically powerless to stop this movement, and they use campaign spending to prove their point. They cite a Texas primary where establishment figures, like John Cornyn and the Republican Campaign Committee, supposedly outspent Ken Paxton by a massive ratio of 9-1. But despite that crazy financial advantage, Paxton still won. The channel uses this to argue that traditional political money is failing, simply because the voters are now entirely siding with this new aggressive strategy. And because of all this, the source asserts that the D.C. establishment is in a complete, quote, hair-on-fire panic. They point out that Republican Bill Cassidy got wiped out in his own primary. They claim the Senate is in open conflict with the president, voting down election integrity measures. Most dramatically, though, they allege that Democrat Mark Warner is actually threatening to blow up FISA Section 702, which is a massive piece of surveillance authority, rather than allow the new DNI, Bill Pai, to oversee it. The implication is that the establishment would literally rather disarm its own intelligence machine than let an outsider hold the keys. Which brings us to Section 5, the promised outcome, unification versus division. After laying out this incredibly intense narrative of political warfare and counter-coups, we really need to analyze what the channel claims this fight is actually meant to achieve at the end of the day. It's actually really fascinating because despite the highly combative, almost martial rhetoric used throughout the entire piece, the host concludes by claiming the ultimate goal here is national unification. They state the mission is to declare independence from that British rule playbook of division, to defeat the psychological warfare that's turning the nation against itself, and to create a rising economic tide. And they specifically name working-class Americans here: coal miners, auto workers, waitresses, and truck drivers. They're framing all these aggressive tactics as just necessary steps to finally achieve shared economic success. The source then closes with this powerful final framing. Welcome to the Summer of America 250. By tying their entire narrative of this counteroffensive to the upcoming 250th anniversary of the United States, the channel packages this whole political conflict as a patriotic reclamation. They're telling their viewers that this fight is ultimately about securing their American birthright to self-govern. And that brings us to the end of our breakdown. We've seen exactly how this source uses these sweeping timelines, stark historical analogies like the partition of India, and intense language of warfare to construct a highly specific narrative for its audience. So as we wrap up this explainer today, I want to leave you with this thought to mull over. How do these dramatic historical analogies shape and influence our perception of complex contemporary events? When media channels use historical trauma to frame modern politics, how does that fundamentally change the way we view our neighbors and our institutions? Thank you so much for walking through the structure with me today. Keep asking questions and always keep looking closely at how the narrative is built.